Okay, Module 6, Part 2. Let's continue on with the social psych. So how do your attitudes affect you? I mean, we have attitudes about everything, right? If you have a religion, you've got attitudes about religious belief, political views, feelings about music, movies, you name it, we've got attitudes about it. And our feelings and beliefs are shaped by things like social context, and they play a role in how we evaluate other people and interact with them, right? So how we were raised affects our religious beliefs, for example. Like I was raised without formal religion. I mean, we did Christmas and Easter because they were fun, but we didn't go to church or anything like that. And so that affects my behaviors. Like as an adult, I don't go to church. I don't observe religious ritual and things like that, right? And my engagement or lack thereof in those kinds of behaviors is going to further influence and refine my attitudes and have impacts on my life. So, the fact that I don't go to church means I don't have that kind of community support that some people have, for example, right? So where do our attitudes come from? So attitudes are the feelings and beliefs that we hold. They can affect our behavior, right? What you believe and how you feel affects the behaviors you engage in. But it's also true that behaviors you engage in can affect your attitudes. Sometimes we behave consistently with our attitudes, sometimes we don't. So let's talk about how attitudes can predict behavior sometimes. In general, the stronger and more personally relevant an attitude is, the more likely it is to predict behavior, and the greater the chance that a person's actions will be consistent across different situations, right? So if you believe any of these things really strongly, you hold these values dear, then it's going to be more likely to be the case that you will behave consistently with them. Also, the more specific the attitude is, the more predictive it is, right? So I've got as a kind of goofy example, Star Wars fans versus Star Trek fans. If you are passionate about something like this, then it's probably going to predict your behaviors, right? If you're pro Star Trek and anti Star Wars, you maybe don't even go see the Star Wars movies. Okay, so the stronger and more personally relevant the attitude, the more likely it is to predict behavior. And the more specific the attitude, the more likely it is to predict behavior. Also, attitudes formed through direct experience tend to be better predictors of behavior. So, of all of these values on here, I believe all of these, I believe them pretty powerfully, but there are some that I have directly experienced, right? Like women's rights are human rights. As a woman, I have experienced sexism, right? As all women have. So I'm going to kind of hold those values particularly close because I've lived them, right? So where do they come from? Attitudes can develop in three ways. One is called the mere exposure effect. Oops, I forgot to set my timer. Hang on a sec, folks. I don't want to go too long here. Okay, so the mere exposure effect, which is the more you're exposed to something, the more you tend to like it, right? So for example, people prefer to look at their mirror image than the way they actually look because that's what we're used to. Okay, so the more you are exposed to something, the more you tend to like it. Learning, this is another way that we can develop attitudes. So for example, advertisers use classical conditioning to create positive attitudes about their products. So they're going to pair their product with something or someone you already like, right? So for fans of Rihanna, maybe their warm, fuzzy feelings about Rihanna will rub off on the product that she is hawking, right? Classical conditioning. And then operant conditioning too, right? It will also shape attitudes. If you're praised every time you recycle, then you're actually going to have a more positive attitude about recycling. This is part of, raising kids to do stuff like that. And then the third big way we can develop attitudes is through being socialized. That is, we look at other people, we listen to what they're saying, we see how other people behave, and we model them, right? So there are powerful role models in our lives. that, we get information from about how we should be thinking and feeling. Right? The Pope is an example there, but, your parents, your friends, the people you look up to in, music or art, right? So yeah, caregivers, teachers, peers, religious leaders, political leaders, et cetera, can all guide our attitudes through their examples. Okay, so one big way we get the attitudes we end up with is by watching role models and learning from them. All right, so some terminology: the mere exposure effect, learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, socialization. These are 3 ways we develop the attitudes that we end up with. We can talk about explicit versus implicit attitudes here too. While explicit attitudes are feelings and beliefs that we are aware of, just like explicit memory is sort of voluntarily, consciously trying to remember stuff, explicit attitudes, we know we have these attitudes. But implicit attitudes, we don't always know that we hold these views or values. So there is a test called the implicit association test, which claims to measure things like unconscious prejudices, racism, sexism, ageism, other isms, right? So yeah, if you Google implicit association test, Harvard, you'll come up with this link, and you'll be able to actually take a version of the IAT. It's pretty interesting. So, for example, during the 2008 presidential election, where for the first time a person of color was on the ballot, a lot of people wondered whether attitudes about people of color would affect some people's willingness to vote for Barack Obama. And they found that people higher in explicit self-reported racial prejudice were less likely to vote for him. That's not shocking, right? That would be people who are racist and know they're racist, right? But they also found that people reporting low levels of racial prejudice, but whose scores on that IAT test indicated negative attitudes about people of color, they were also less likely to vote for him. And so for this second group, their implicit attitudes were better predictors of behavior than their explicit attitudes. So that's an interesting finding. Prejudices can go underground, and a person can swear up and down that they are not prejudiced, but this test suggests there are unconscious biases, right, afoot in like probably most of us. All right, let's talk a little bit about what happens when we hold conflicting attitudes, right? A discrepancy between 2 beliefs or between a belief and an action can lead to this mental feeling, this state of unpleasant tension called cognitive dissonance, right? So that can happen when people hold conflicting attitudes. For example, believing that being mean to animals is bad and wrong, but also knowing that you eat them can create cognitive dissonance, create this unpleasant tension. Like, how do those 2 ideas get along? So back in the 50s, Leon Festinger came up with a theory of cognitive dissonance to explain what happens when we're holding conflicting attitudes in our minds at the same time. Okay, so cognitive dissonance is this unpleasant state of tension between 2 opposing thoughts, and we're motivated to reduce that dissonance. It doesn't feel good. So we can reduce the conflict, the dissonance between the 2 cognitions by changing the first one, or changing the second one, or introducing a third idea that helps the other 2 kind of get along, right? So for example, having the belief that you're an honest person. Most people like to believe, I'm an honest person. But what happens if someone who believes they're an honest person also knows that they just cheated on their psych test? Those 2 things don't get along. You can't be honest and cheat, right? So as a way to manage and reduce this dissonance, you could change the first cognition. Oh, I'm not an honest person after all. Not a popular choice because it can impact our self-esteem. So a more popular idea might be to change the second cognition, right? I'm an honest person and I didn't really cheat, right? I just saw somebody's answers. I didn't even change mine, right? Or come up with a third idea that reconciles A and B. I'm an honest person. Yes, I cheated on that test, but I had to. The test was unfair. Everybody else was cheating. The only thing I could do to make it fair was also cheat. Okay, so that's a mental dipsy doodle to try and make those two ideas get along and reduce cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance also arises when you have positive attitudes about different options, but you got to choose one, right? So these scenarios where you've got choices to make, they all seem good and you got to pick one, right? Like let's say you're trying to decide which apartment to rent and you kind of see good things in all your choices. After you pick one, you might feel some regret. I got to pick this one, but oh, that other one was so cool. This is called post-decisional dissonance, right? So after the decision is made, you might have this feeling of, ugh, I might have not done the right thing. So this post-decisional dissonance will motivate us typically to focus on the one we did pick and like think about all the ways that that was the right choice. And then look at the one we didn't pick and see all the ways that it wasn't the right choice. Right? So this happens automatically. We're not sort of consciously deciding to do this, but it helps us reduce that post-decisional dissonance to say, yeah, I made the right choice. This place is good. That other place would have been a problem. All right, so cognitive dissonance, post-decisional dissonance. Okay. Attitudes can also be changed through persuasion. So persuasion is changing somebody's mind, right? So there's three factors that influence persuasiveness. We can talk about the source, we can talk about the message itself, and we can talk about the receiver. So let's start with the source. What we mean here is, who's delivering the message? So in general, more credible sources are more effective, right? If it's somebody you can believe, a more attractive source is more effective. Okay. Content of the message itself, the research shows strong arguments that appeal to emotion can be quite persuasive. So if you have like good points you want to make and you can make the person feel something, then that's a powerful persuasive message. And repetition is also persuasive. So the more times somebody hears an argument, the more likely they are to believe it. Right? Like the whole, efforts to try to get everybody vaccinated when we were faced with the COVID crisis, right? So the content of the message, this guy, Dr. Anthony Fauci, one of the world-renowned experts in communicative disease, right? You couldn't get more credible than this guy. And he was the voice of sort of government response to COVID, right? And then what was it he was saying? He was talking about how vaccines are going to save your life, right? And the lives of people you love. The third component there is who's the target audience, right? Who is it you're trying to persuade? So that's the receiver. You got to think about things like how smart is this group? How educated is this group? How skeptical? How much do they already know about the subject matter, age, demographics, and so on, right? So if you're trying to convince senior citizens to get the COVID vaccine, you're going to use different talking points than if you're trying to convince a 22-year-old, right? So there's a model for persuasion called the elaboration likelihood model that says there are two pathways to persuading others, right? Two different ways you can go about this. So for example, let's say a car salesperson is trying to get you to buy a pickup truck. Okay, so you're at the lot and they're giving you their pitch. A pitch via the central route would include things like the salesperson telling you about all the good things the truck can do, the great mileage it gets, how handy it's going to be to have a pickup truck, right? So central route strategies focus on information, giving you all the good info about this purchase, right? Now, to be open to persuasion via the central route would require that you're motivated and able to evaluate the information coming in, right? Now, that takes time and effort. And remember, we're a lazy species, so we're only going to do this when we have to, right? When it's a super important decision, when there's a lot on the line, then maybe we sit down and actually look at the facts, right? The other option is the peripheral route. Peripheral means off to the side, right? So it's not a central argument. It's where, like, the salesman's tactic might be to convince you how super cool you'd look behind the wheel, right? How your friends are all going to be jealous. So this would be focusing on surface aspects of the situation. And we tend to take this route, we tend to be vulnerable to persuasion via this route when we're distracted, rushed, not motivated to think too deeply, because this is just easier. Okay? Now, persuasion via the peripheral route leads to attitude change that is weaker and more unstable than persuasion via the central route. Okay, so if you do manage to change someone's mind by presenting them with information, that change is probably permanent. If, on the other hand, you sway their opinion because of some superficial argument, that might end up changing back later. So persuasion, the source, the message, the receiver, the elaboration, the likelihood model of persuasion, which says you've got two options, central route, peripheral route. Okay. How do other people influence you? So we tend to behave differently when we're in different groups. So how does the presence of other people affect our behavior? First of all, we are powerfully motivated to fit in to whatever groups we're part of, right? So remember, we are hardwired with the need to belong. So we're going to try to present ourselves in the best light, not offend the other members of the group, conform to the norms of the group, obey the authority figures in the group, and so on, right? We don't want to be kicked out of the group. We might even end up engaging in behaviors we would otherwise condemn. So sometimes, if the group is doing something that you would never have chosen to do on your own, you might do it too in order to be part of the group. Okay, so the power of the social situation is much greater than most people believe. Okay, lots of times people are doing things because of the situation they are in. All right, so let's talk a little bit about social facilitation and social loafing. So social facilitation is when the presence of others improves one's performance, right? The presence of an audience makes you perform better. This is likely going to be the situation if the task is something that you find easy or something that you have learned really, really well. For difficult tasks or tasks where the person doesn't really know the task very well, the presence of others can actually get in the way and kind of make you choke, right? So the secret to success in front of an audience is to be prepared, right? Know it really well. Social loafing is the tendency for people to work less hard when they're in a group than when they're working by themselves. So this happens particularly when any efforts are pooled, so individuals don't feel personally responsible for the group's output, right? Like working in groups on a school project, right? Very often what happens is, one poor schmuck does most of the work and others kind of ride the coattails. That's social loafing. Now, on the other hand, if people know their own individual efforts will be monitored, you can sort of combat social loafing that way. So a professor might say, yes, you've got a group project, but I'm going to give you each an individual score for your contribution. Okay. Then there's de-individuation. So when we're in a group, we can sometimes become less aware of ourselves as individuals and pay less attention to our normal standards of personal conduct. That's de-individuation. And it's more likely to happen when we're anonymous in a group, meaning, other people are not going to be able to kind of pick us out of the group. When we're physiologically aroused, that's high heart rate, blood pressure, and all of that. And when responsibility for any consequences is not clear. So what we're looking at in the picture here is the Proud Boys marching towards Freedom Plaza during a protest on December 12th, 2020. Note that they are de-individuated, right? Everybody's in the same colors. Lots of people are wearing sunglasses, hats, masks. So it's going to be hard to identify any given individual there. Under those circumstances, there's like a freeing up of the possibilities for behavior. Right? Each individual is going to feel relatively impervious. So in the 60s, James Stoner found groups often make riskier decisions than individuals do. He called this the risky shift effect. And it helps explain why people in a group might try something really dangerous that none of them would have tried alone. We're looking at January 6, 2021, the insurrection attempt, on the Capitol building. No one person in this group would have been likely to do any of those things if they weren't in the big group, right? These are highly risky behaviors that are more likely to happen with group dynamics. It's also possible, by the way, that groups can become more cautious instead of more risk-taking. It all depends on what the initial attitudes of the group are. So if most people in a group start out cautious, then the group gets even more cautious. If they start out wanting to take a risk, then the group sort of drifts towards greater risk. So this is called group polarization. Group polarization happens when group discussion strengthens the dominant position held by individual group members, right? So if individual members of a group tend to agree that smoking is kind of bad for you, then it can get more extreme through discussion and you end up advocating, a more extreme policy perhaps. Another example, let's say you go to a movie with your friends and while you're watching this movie, you're thinking, it's not terrific, it's not going to win any Oscars, but it's okay, it's meh. And then afterwards, when you're talking about the movie with your friends, people start mentioning all the different ways the movie was not awesome. And before you know it, the group has kind of shifted towards a view that says it was awful, even though no one individual had been thinking that. Okay, so if the average opinion starts out mildly negative, after discussion, it becomes more negative. If the opinion starts out mildly positive, after discussion, it becomes more strongly positive. That's polarization, right? It's being polarized to an extreme. I'm going to pause here. We'll pick it up at groupthink in the next segment.